Well, hi everybody. Welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm Bill Whittle, and it's great to see you. Great to be here. It's a little bit lighting different here. I think I might have finally figured out the way to get these skin tones a little bit better. Went with the purple in the background instead of the blue, and everything looks pretty groovy. So, as as Billy Crystal famously said, it's better to look good than to feel good, darling. It's great to be here. We have deep issues tonight on the Stratosphere Lounge, and as I mentioned, I have to get out of here pretty early. I really only got about an hour. I have to get in the car and fly down to kiss the ring of the Blogfather. Glenn Reynolds is in town, and that's not a chore. I know I've said this probably 100 times. I've said it to his face several times, but I just wouldn't be here without Glenn Reynolds, and that's all there is to it. I just wouldn't be here without him. He is one of the greatest, kindest, most unassuming, modest guys in the whole wide world. He comes into town occasionally. He's going to be down in Santa Monica for a couple of drinks and stuff in the evening at 7 o'clock, which is about an hour from now. I'm going to be late for that, but I can do an hour, I think, and still get down there fashionably late. You just want to kind of come in there and just kind of at that groovy time and do my sunglasses. Now, it's probably not fair for me to put my sunglasses on. I don't know if the ladies in the audience will be able to take it. Hey, come on. Am I late? Hey, I'll have a, how about a, I don't know, baby, hit me with a Bloody Mary. Can't do that. That would be obnoxious. So we do love Glenn, and I'm looking forward to seeing him. So all that to simply say, let's get on with it. Before we do, I had a series of heart palpitations yesterday. I had to kind of change the schedule of the show at the last second yesterday. And the reason is because I got the DVD master back that day and the day before. Actually got the master back the day before, with a, when you have a book printed, you get the galley, and it's like, here's what we're going to run. So it had better be good. And I took a look at it. It looked great. And then I took a look at it at home, and it hung up in two places. Not for long, just skipped. Just a little bit. Just skipped. A little tiny bit. And we were able to repeat it, so it's something on the master. We have to send it back, and I'm just so... I worry about that being so late so much. I can't tell you the stress. Can't tell you the stress that causes me. So I just had to pound it around, get that thing fixed, get it out the door. So I have a better update from them when we get that and reburn it. But when you're about to make minimum of 2,000 of something, and hopefully more than that, if I had left that there in order to get this thing out on time, that's all I would see. I would just I'd be like, there's that little skip. So anyway, that's what caused the delay yesterday. I was just, like I said, on the Facebook post, is like being in the trash compactor on the Death Star. It's like the walls are moving in. So anyway, let's get going, because these are great questions, some of the best questions I've ever seen, and I really just, I wish we could get them all. When we get this DVD out the door, and the studio space here resolved, we've got so much material here that we may have to do Stratosphere Lounge on a multiple times a week basis or something like that. We'll figure out what we'll do. But let's get going. So let's start with our good friend Max Conkey, or Conkey. Max, I've seen your name written so many times, I don't know if I've ever said it aloud. Anyway, howdy, Max. Max is stalwart, and it goes back a long way. And he asked a question which I think is very, like all of the ones that we're taking tonight, very kind of profound in its own sort of way. And that question is, going galt, copping out? I'm serious on this one. It's fight or flight, right? And I guess really the essence of what we're asking here is, do we drop out? Do we leave the country? Do we go someplace else? And then that would be the bigger interpretation of that issue. The smaller interpretation of the issue, rather than actually just packing up and leaving the country, would be, do we stop working so hard? And I have two answers, so I'll give you both of them. In terms of not working so hard, I think not only do I think it's a smart thing to do, and I think it's the morally right thing to do. When Obamacare requires, that once you're at 30 hours a week or more, then the requirements for Obamacare kick in. What President Genius has done, along with former Speaker of the House Nancy Genius and Senate Majority Leader Harry Genius, is just make sure that people who are on the edges are not going to make any money at all, because anybody who's got half a brain will tell you that if these enormous financial obligations for a business kick in at 30 hours of work week, then they'll just put everybody on 29 hours, and it's just that simple. I mean, just how stupid people are these people? And actually, that's the good news. It's kind of where I keep coming back to these days of horrors and wonders out there. Just when every day seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse, and you just can't believe that there's a new low to be achieved. Well, there is. And I keep coming back now. For the last several years, I've had this thought. It's like, if these people weren't so incompetent, we'd be completely boned. Thank God they're evil and stupid, because if they weren't so stupid, where would we be? We'd be in big, big, big trouble. But they are that stupid. So the small question about going Galt is, should you be doing less work? Yes. If the government says that at 30 hours, you all of a sudden have to pay these outrageous taxes and fines and penalties for things for people who really should maybe be getting their own income health care, then stop them at 30. And if it turns out that your income bracket kicks in at, remember it was $250,000, I think, when in the '08 campaign, I remember John McCain nodding sagely when the idea that if you are if you make $250,000, you're an evil person, but if you make $249,999.99 and you're a good person who needs help from the government, make less than that. And do it until this guy's out of office. The one thing that I've been saying for a long time now, and I think is getting to be clear, one of the reasons his numbers are so low and getting lower, is we have to allow the American people to feel the consequences of their decisions. And Obamacare is not news. Obamacare was the first time people realized, wait a minute, you're going to offer more health care, better health care to more people, better health care to more people, and it's going to cost more money instead of less? How is that? Really? Yeah, that's how economics work. Now, the people who voted for him because of his smart diplomacy and his ability to understand the nuances of the international picture in a way that ignorant cowboy George W. Bush never could fathom, those people are starting to get the word too now. They're starting to realize that it's obvious that he's a joke. He's a joke to the Russians. He's a joke to the Saudis. He's a joke to our allies. He insults our allies. He kisses up to our enemies and thinks that means they're going to be nice to us. Well, they're not going to be nice to us. You know why? Because they're our enemies. That's why. So the situation in Crimea and the Red Line in Syria and all this other stuff is all just a way for people to understand what's really going on. So to answer your question, Max, no, going Galt is not copping out. If he's determined to smack people who generate less wealth until somebody who comes along who's in favor of wealth generation. Let these young people who voted for him in big numbers, let them live with their parents till they're 30. That's what they voted for. Now is their chance to get their own deal. Now, the bigger question is, if it's fight or flight, if you take going Galt to mean dropping out of society or doing less work or kind of walking your factory back or doing something like that, that's one thing. I'm kind of in favor of that. If going Galt means leaving America and going to Galt's Gulch, and literally just one day you're in the office and the next day you're gone and you're underneath the invisible mirror screen or whatever they had there for Galt's Gulch. This brings up two interesting questions. And the first and more important one is, where do you go? Where do you go? I've given this a great deal of thought. Where do you go? I'm not going to live in Honduras. I'm sorry, I'm not going to live in Honduras. I'm not going to live in some place where some other country has a huge army, or where I'm just not going to do it. I'm not going to live on an island. I think if you were going to really talk about getting away from America let's be careful about this, because people like us are not talking about getting away from America. We're talking about taking America with us. We're talking about going to America. We're talking about taking the flag and the idea and the Constitution, the limited government, individual freedoms, and going to a different patch of ground where America can be America rather than the patch of ground that we have traditionally thought of as America, where every day we become less and less like America. If we were talking about packing up, bringing the flag, the Constitution, and everything else, then where do you go? I don't know. The only two places that I've thought of, to be perfectly honest with you, and everybody has their own choice. Look, I grew up in Florida. I'm not going to live in the jungle. I'm not going to live in Honduras. Not going to live in South America. There's no place in Europe. There's no place in Asia. There's no place in Russia where you're not completely surrounded by large totalitarian governments. I suppose an island is possible, small island. Various islands, Costa Rica, I'm sorry, I was saying Honduras. I meant to say Costa Rica this whole time. Both of those have got relatively good reputations. I'm just not going to live in the jungles of Central America, and I'm not. The three places you're really left with are Texas, which, frankly, we don't have to wait for an economic collapse. Texas is turning liberal already. So what's going to happen if the world economy collapses? What's going to happen if these things continue to go? So Texas is undefendable, frankly. You can't defend Texas against the rest of the country. What can you do? Nothing. So that leaves us with just a couple of choices, really. It leaves us with Alaska. I like Alaska because this is me, right? Everybody's a little different. But I happen to have in my heart this belief that America needs to be a somewhat cold country. It can't be a tropical. I have a hard time imagining tropical America. I always feel that one of the qualities about America is the fact that it is crisp. That's the word I'm looking for, crisp. And it gets plenty crisp up in Alaska. But when you think about America, you think of Montana, Colorado, Wyoming. That's not South Florida, and it's not even Arizona, really, although Arizona feels more like America than South Florida does to me. So Alaska has the benefit of being far enough away if things got and being so far away, frankly, that it's really hardly worth the federal government's time and trouble to come and mess with you there. Unlike California, which is a huge economy, generates an awful lot of revenue. Alaska is awful far out of the way there. You'd have to deal with the very understandable reluctance of the rest of Alaskans to put up with you. But if you were to make the case, hey, we're coming to bring America with us, we're not coming to Californicate Alaska, you might be able to pull it off. A second thought I've had in terms of if I had to get out of the country and go put up an actual republic someplace is Antarctica, for the same reason. It's chilly and it's remote. And there's something else about Alaska and Antarctica that they have in common with the American frontier, and they have in common with the third place I'll mention too. And that is that they're difficult to live in. And this may sound like a very simple thing, but when you get down to brass tacks, I actually think this is in fact the distinguishing characteristic of freedom. I think it needs to be a place where it's difficult to live. I think you have to be confronted with the hardship of surviving every day first. And then when you do that, you select out a certain amount of idiocy. I have never, ever been in a more pleasant place and seen stupider people than at an art show in Santa Barbara, California. That is without question the most gorgeous, beautiful, perfect beach, the most amazing climate, 72 degrees. Outdoors is air-conditioned here in California. And it's just stunning, and I've never seen so many stupid people. You don't get that kind of stupidity in Alaska, and you don't get that kind of stupidity in Antarctica because it's hard to survive there. You've got to want to be there, and that's what the frontier was. You think about the frontier, and it's like the Ponderosa and everything. You got to look at this from the point of view of people who came off of, either boats or wooden vessels or later as we got into the beginning of the 20th century off of, the big steamliner expansion. These people are coming from tenements and slums. They're coming from the slums of London. They're coming from the slums of Glasgow and the slums of Berlin and the slums of Rome. And they're all coming. Many of them stayed in the cities, but the ones that came out west were living in a very difficult thing with Indians and bears and frozen winters and not enough food and everything. So there's something about the frontier that breeds self-sufficiency, independence, hard work, sacrifice, mutual sacrifice, but not coercive mutual sacrifice. There's nobody there with a big stick telling you got to go help out your neighbors. You go help your neighbors because you're going to need help someday. That idea is magnificent. And as the third example of places where you can go, you've got outer space. And I have given more thought to living in outer space than most people alive today. I can say that with some confidence. But the problem with living in outer space is that living in outer space sucks. It just does. And we can talk about the romance of walking out on the moon, and I'm going to walk on the moon or die trying. We've got this free frontier thing coming up in a couple years. Don't you worry. I got some plans about walking on the moon. But the moon, look, here's the thing. You get out of the Earth's atmosphere and you have the moon. That's all there is. Mars is essentially the moon. It's a pretty near perfect vacuum. Titan, the surface of Titan is deadly poison. You're in a tin can, and you can go out for a walk in a suit and see vistas and wonders, and that'd be great, and I'm all about that. But one of the things I realized as I started thinking about actually living in space and going on missions to Jupiter and started working on the psychology of things like this, and Jacob Golden in the comment section says, under the sea. Under the sea is the same thing. Same thing. Ultimately, when it's said and done, you are talking about living in a tin can. And while the views may be spectacular and the freedom and space and all that groovy stuff, you're still living in a tin can. We are not built for that. We're really not. And if I had an active space program, I'd want to go on space mission to Jupiter and I'd want to spend some time on Mars, but I would want to look forward to coming back and living in Montana or something. I don't want to live in a tin can for the rest of my life. I have a hard enough time living in a decent-sized apartment. It's just there. So the moon and space are great, but they're not real. They don't really count. Put the technical problems aside, psychological issues. So to answer your bigger question, Max, if it were me, I'd prepare myself for Alaska if things got reasonably bad, and Antarctica if things went all the way south. And Antarctica only because you have to go a long way to come and get you in Antarctica. And I cannot imagine in a world where going to Antarctica is now the best option. I cannot imagine any reason why it would be worth a government to go and fight you in Antarctica. Something bad has happened under those situations. So anyway, that's it. I say as far as the small going galt, though, if these guys want to tax you at a certain rate, make $1 less than that rate. And let them have the benefits of the socialism that they voted for. They can figure out the Laffer curve just as easily as anybody else. We used to talk about income disparity in America and how much wealth the individuals hold. They didn't hold this much wealth 100 years ago. That's true, because 100 years ago we had no corporate tax or income tax. 100 years ago, if you had a family fortune, the smart thing to do was to invest it in business so that you could make an even bigger family fortune. But when these tax rates and inheritance tax and capital gains tax rates are this high, the smart thing is to just sit on it. So, there you go. Anyway, we got a lot to do, so let's move on. I'm just trying to think about which ones I want to take here. I mean, I've got a bunch of them. Okay, let's go with this one. Kurt Von Arnold says, how do I reconcile my belief that free market capitalism is an absolute good, lifting more people out of poverty than any other system, with my desire to protect the jobs and livelihoods of my fellow citizens from competing markets that are destroying them? And I assume he means overseas markets, although certainly it's possible to lose your job to domestic competition as well. Well, first of all, we have to understand that as much as I love this country and as much as I love capitalism, and I sure do love them both, I don't believe that we've ever had free market capitalism in America. There is a remarkable book. I've interviewed the author of it a couple times on PJTV. I highly recommend it. I'm embarrassed I don't have his name in front of me, but I do remember the book, and it's called The Myth of the Robber Barons. If you go look at The Myth of the Robber Barons, what that will show you is that all throughout the history of capitalism in America, which is the example and the model for capitalism and wealth generation throughout the world, what you find is that there were two different kinds of people, and the author of this book, who hopefully somebody will be able to provide me with in a minute here, was very, very clear on this, and he put them in a way I'd never thought of him before, but it's a very, very illuminating and insightful way to think of things. Bert Folsom, thank you, Wild Goose. Bert Folsom said that there were two kinds of entrepreneurs during the age of the so-called robber barons who weren't really robber barons. He said they were political entrepreneurs and market entrepreneurs. And political entrepreneurs were people who, like Robert Fulton, who invented the steamboat, and then he basically went to the government, in that case it was a state government in New York, and said, hey, I've got a steamboat, and how about if you license me and legally say I'm the only guy who can run a steamboat up and down this route on these rivers in New York, and in exchange for this license, I will pay you a percentage of the fares. And the same thing was true with the sorry, I almost did it. I caught myself. The president didn't, but I did. The Transcontinental Railroad, same thing was true with that, where the Union Pacific and the Union Pacific and Western Pacific were fighting to meet in the middle of the country, and they were getting enormous subsidies from the government. But along comes a guy, back to the steamboat, for example, along comes Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was in fact a market entrepreneur, looked at the collusion between government and business that Fulton had, and basically said, well, I'm locked out of competing with this guy. I don't have the subsidies from the government, so I'm going to have to carry more passengers, which means I'm going to have to charge a lower rate, and that means I'm going to have to be far more efficient. Vanderbilt then took that attitude later into the transatlantic trade, because the British had subsidized the mail route from Britain to America with Cunard lines. We had a subsidized route ourselves. And basically, Vanderbilt said, I'm going to carry mail for free, and I'm going to cut the transatlantic fares by a factor of 90%. And what ended up happening was everybody got to ride, and he made more money, and he put the subsidized guys out of business because he appealed to the people. It was a Great Northern Railroad, was the one that James J. Hill built. Thanks, Dave Olson. Another example of a guy who used his own money. And in the case of Vanderbilt using his own money, Hill using his own money, and all of these market entrepreneurs who use their own money, they provided better service and better quality and better safety because they had to. Since they were using their own money, the railroad that James Hill built, the Great Northern, for example, was laid out far more efficiently than the ones that the two big government-sponsored railroads were, because the government-sponsored railroads understood that the market was from the government. So the faster they could put track down, the more money they got, the more land grants they got. That meant they didn't have to be very efficient in terms of the surveying, didn't have to be very efficient in terms of the quality of the rail. But when they were laying down the private railroad, he had to make it absolutely as level as he could. He had to make the grades as low as he could. He had to use the highest quality rails that he could. And because he built a much better railroad technologically, I mean to say, he was able to charge a lower rate. And that lower rate meant that he could outcompete the guys even with a subsidy. And finally, the guys with the subsidy offered to pay him a huge part of the subsidy to get out of business. Did the same thing again and again and again all over the board. So please read Myth of the Robber Barons by Folsom, Dr. Folsom, because it really explains this for you, Kurt. And I want to get into it a little bit more. To say simply this: when a person loses their job under the ideal free market, one of two things is happening. They're losing their job to a company that is out competing them. They're just selling better widgets or better cars, or it's a better restaurant. I mean, think about this. Nobody really talks about this. I can't remember if this was in Dr. Folsom's book or not, but if you have two restaurants on the same block and one of them is just jammed all the time and you can't get in and the other one's going out of business, why is that? It's the same location, it's the same clientele, it's the same customers, same neighborhood. Somebody's doing an awful lot better job of providing a service than the other guy. And they're succeeding, and people are voting with their wallets and with their feet. So, generally speaking, when you have the ability to compete freely, losing a job to competition means the market is growing. It means that business is growing, and people who are fired don't normally get executed. This business about allowing GM to go bankrupt, that Romney got into such trouble for. People talked about Romney saying this as if Romney meant, let's allow GM to go bankrupt, which means we'll bulldoze all the factories down and we'll line all the people up and push them over a cliff. That's not what he was talking about at all. He was talking about bankruptcy as a legal declaration, which meant that he could renegotiate contracts. It allowed him to renegotiate a contract at a better rate. So when you talk about friends losing jobs to competition, that actually is good for everybody. Competition lowers the rates for everybody, makes everything less expensive. This cell phone costs what it costs, not because Apple's kindness. This cell phone costs what it costs because the Apple iPhone is priced because of Samsung. If Samsung wasn't there, then they could charge whatever they want for this thing. So competition actually helps people, helps everybody's lives by lowering prices across the board and raising quality at the same time. When you get the government involved in this process, you don't have capitalism anymore, or free market capitalism as we understand it. We have what's often called crony capitalism, which we shouldn't use because there's no capitalism as far as we're concerned. People just taint the term. The correct term for that is mercantilism. That's where the government basically takes money from big companies. They use that money to get elected. Once elected, they write laws that keep the competition away from those big companies. And GM doesn't have to compete because GM is legally protected. And that goes all the way down to little things like a hairstylist and their license. Have you ever gotten to somebody for a haircut? Have you ever gone to a hairdresser or gotten a haircut based on the certificate on the wall? Have you ever gone and said, I've heard that the Davidson School of Cosmetology is the best school there is. Which school did you go to? No one does that. Everybody gets a personal recommendation from friends. This guy's really good. And things like licenses like that keep competition out of the market, which is why the people in business like it. The governments like it because it gives them more power, and they like power, and it gives them licensing fees and fines, both of which they like. So there's that kind of competition. And I think the displacement caused by that kind of competition is a temporary displacement. But there's also the competition and, the loss of jobs that you were referring to there, Kurt, that comes about from people losing their jobs because of entire sectors moving overseas. If a business moves overseas, that's one thing. If a sector moves overseas, that's something else. Manufacturing, for example. Manufacturing is an interesting example, which I'll come back to in just a quick moment. But the classic example, of course, is, what do you do to protect the job of the baleen hoop skirt manufacturers and the horse and carriage buggy whip manufacturers? How do you protect their jobs? You don't. You don't protect their jobs. Those people are going to lose their jobs because those entire sectors are going away and they're not coming back. Those people need to be retrained. And as the world moves up, then people get better jobs. If a person had manufactured buggy whips at the beginning of their career and moved into a job, let's say repairing televisions, they probably made more money repairing televisions than they did repairing buggy whips. So even though you have to train people again, and there's displacement and insecurity and stress, and believe me, if anybody understands that, you're talking to this guy, because I've been living my life as a gig-based life for 40 years now, and I know what it's like to not know where the next paycheck's coming from. That's virtually my entire life. I get the stress of it. I do. But when you have entire sectors leaving, it may be time to be looking for not just a different job, but a different line of work, a better line of work. There's two more things I will say about this. One of them is, the internet tells us something. The existence of the internet tells us something about human nature, and what it tells us isn't good. Because if I had told you, I almost did a series about this called Adventures in Tomorrowland or Adventures in Tomorrow, something like that. I was going to do a series of videos shot like from the early 1960s in black and white and imagine a world where we have all these things. But if you were to tell somebody back any time other than prior to the actual internet itself, which is mid-90s, if you had told people that every single person in America, with very few exceptions, would have in their house a device that allowed them for free or for a monthly service fee of negligible cost, the entire combined knowledge of the human race was at their fingertips 24/7, and furthermore, that there were literally countless numbers of job training opportunities where you could watch somebody do a task in front of you on this magical screen, learn how to do it yourself, get certified for it yourself, and do it for free, such as with Apple University. People would have said this is going to change the world for the better, and it hasn't happened. People use the internet for online gaming and internet porn, Facebook, and a couple of emails. So the fact that the internet provides essentially free job training for essentially any job you could imagine, and the fact that so few people are using this opportunity tells us something about human nature. It tells us an awful lot about government entitlements. But just as an example, I am not a plumber. I have no plumbing skills at all. None. I come from a family on my father's side where there were 2 or 3 generations of plumbers. It was a step up out of being cotton carters in a mill in Lancashire. Well, I don't know anything about plumbing. But I could become a plumber for free. I could learn the tools of plumbing. I could learn the techniques of plumbing, and I can get myself certified for plumbing for essentially free if I wanted to become a plumber. I could do it. That's true for just about anything. Online mathematics course for free, online business courses for free. You can train yourself to do just about any job you can imagine for just about free, and very few people don't. Isn't that amazing? And that's sad. It's true, though. So that's the good news. We have to be teaching people not to depend on the government. We need to be teaching people how to use this amazing box that we're talking on right now. And the final thing I'll say about sectors and entire industries disappearing is that sometimes they can come back. And as I mentioned in that last Afterburner, Gulliver Unbound, when you are talking about manufacturing leaving the country, which it largely has done, and manufacturing is a good thing to have for a country, because in the industrial era, with the assembly line, you don't have to teach a person how to build a car. You only have to teach a person how to put the steering wheel on the steering column. That's all you have to do. So it allows people to with a relatively simple education, a relatively low IQ, it allows people to have a decent living. So when that thing leaves, then it's almost impossible for it to come back. So let's talk about why. When manufacturing leaves America, it's because Nike, I'll just pull them out of the air, Nike wants to sell shoes. Nike knows, as everybody else who's ever been in business knows, that there is a sweet spot, which is a price point at which point you will make the most money. In other words, if I've got a pair of Nike track shoes and they cost me, let's say, $5, and I sell them for $6, I'll sell masses of shoes and I'll make a certain amount of money. If they cost me $5 and I sell them for $500, I'll sell far, far fewer shoes. I'll make more money per sale. But somewhere in there is a number, which is probably around $85, $90, $100, whatever nowadays, something insane like that. There's a price point where you will make the most amount of money per unit of sale. That's that price sweet spot. And every business is looking for that sweet spot because that's how you stay alive. Profit margins in business are so narrow. Most people who hate businesses do not understand that, oh, they're making 40% profit. Are you kidding? Most businesses don't make 1%, 2% profit. Airlines are making, I think I saw a breakdown that says they're making like 16, 17 cents per seat, per trip. Something, profit. It's insane. Okay, so manufacturing leaves America because if I'm going to make a pair of Nike shoes and it costs $5 to make them in America, and I can make them in China for $2 or $1 because Chinese workers will work for less than American workers, then that means that I can still sell them at that sweet spot, that price point, but I'll get to take more of it back into the company. So it's worth it to make the move. In other words, cheap labor in manufacturing is an enormously powerful incentive, and a country that has expensive manufacturing and is making the same pair of shoes as a country that has inexpensive labor, that company with the expensive labor is going to go out of business, all other things being equal. But. As it turns out, raw materials are commodities sold on the world market, so they're more or less, there's transportation costs and all these other things, but they're more or less stable. So really what you have when you make a widget like a pair of shoes is you've got two things. You've got the cost of the labor, which is cheaper overseas, and you've got the cost of the energy, which is cheaper here. You also have the cost of regulation and taxes, which used to be cheaper here, but now is cheaper over there. So if you make the taxes and the regulations lower, you can do that with the swipe of a pen. You automatically tilt the table of manufacturing back this way. And if you throw in cheap and abundant energy through things like fracking, natural gas, atomic power, and all these other things, you can actually get manufacturing jobs back from Asia, where they've got unlimited cheap labor, and Africa and South America. You can get all those jobs back in America, but you need to use your energy advantage. We got to have cheaper energy to make those shoes competitive with the cheap labor, and we have to get these regulations and taxes not eliminated but under control so that we can bring these jobs back to America. And it's not so bloody hard to figure out, honestly. They're not interested in it. They say they are, but they're not. When Barack Obama was campaigning before he was ever elected, all you need to know about Barack Obama is, Mr. Obama, what if we told you that lowering taxes raised revenues? Well, I don't believe that's true. Mr. Obama, just as a thought experiment, what if we told you that by lowering taxes, we raised revenues, which meant that you had more money for the government to spend on poor people? He wouldn't do it. He said, no, the income inequality is the bigger issue. So you poor people out there can pound sand. The main thing is sticking it to the people who are successful. So it's not like they don't know how to do this. They don't know how to figure it out. Of course they know how to figure it out. They just don't want to. They just don't like it. So anyway, that's that. This one will be brief, I assure you, for two reasons. Number one, it's RK, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on RK. And number two, it's a Tiemann's question. So this is the deadly duo of brevity here. But it's an interesting question just because I want to get to it. Isaac Tiemann's asks, does RK theory explain Evan Sayet's unified field theory of liberalism in the same way that general relativity explains Newtonian universal gravitation? I'm going to quibble with the expression because I do believe RK theory explains Evan Sayet's theory of how liberals think, but Evan Sayet doesn't have a unified field theory. RK theory plus Evan Sayet's understanding of how the liberal mind worked, those things together become the unified field theory of psychology. Nobody's written that book yet, but you're looking at the guy who's gonna. Because these things together really work. And the way you get RK theory into the hands of liberals so they can at least take a look at it is you basically you have R characteristics and K characteristics. Ks are competitive, Rs are non-competitive. So since most of us are Ks, and since we're competitive people generally as conservatives, we talk about the R people as rabbit people. We talk about liberals as rabbit people. But the way you get the liberals to listen is you just use the exact same qualities and the exact same traits, and the exact same, just describe them differently. So rather than talking about liberals as being non-competitive, unfit, in terms of genetically unfit to compete and therefore cheat in order to use resources that they would not otherwise be able to obtain. Instead of putting it that way, you use the exact same background, the exact same data, and you basically say that liberals are cooperative and they're not aggressive the way that these K-selective people are. They're not constantly at war with each other and at war with themselves. You just basically phrase it in such a way that you make R sound terrific. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do the first of the return firewalls on this issue. Either that or gaslighting, one or the other. But they're coming as soon as I get this DVD in the mail. You basically, I'm going to set it up so that you can say, here's a set of traits. Which one sounds right to you? And if you phrase it rhetorically in such a way, you can make it a very attractive philosophy, R, to liberals. Lovely. Of course we expose our children to sex earlier than these K-type conservatives. We think sex is wonderful and loving and giving and important. And of course we don't believe that other people are out to harm us. We think that's what causes war in the first place. Structure it all that way so that either side is identifying with what they want, and then you go and make the case. And to my utter amazement, after I read the RK thing, and it just didn't just open my eyes, rewired my brain, I realized that one of my most popular essays, and the essay I did, the big one I did just before I started doing videos, was called Tribes. And it was right after Katrina, and they were talking about the Superdome and all the stuff that was going on there. And I said, my tribe doesn't do these kind of things. My tribe knows how to ration food. My tribe knows how to boil water. My tribe knows how to care for the sick. My tribe knows how to make latrines. My tribe doesn't have all these horrors going on. And I talked about these two different tribes. And what I was describing was R and K, although I didn't have the language for it. I was like Kepler. I was like Kepler trying to describe orbits without calculus. Kepler just didn't have the math to describe how an orbit works. So what Kepler did, trying to describe the mechanics of an oval, since he didn't have calculus to help him with these areas and stuff on a circle, he took the orbit of Mars and divided it up into a series of very, very, very small little equilateral triangles. So rather than an oval, he had a very, very slightly segmented kind of thing. And every one of those little wedges was a new calculation, which he had to do by hand. It took him forever. Suddenly, 150 years after he dies, comes calculus, and then we instantaneously have the language to talk about this problem. So I think RK is the language, and I'm gonna write the unified field theory. I'm gonna make it make sense because I believe it's true. And the more I read about it, and the more I look at the primary research, the more I think it's not only true, I think it's important. And if you don't understand this, then you're doomed to the collapse of civilization. What was it Santayana who said those who don't learn the lessons from history are doomed to repeat them? Why does that happen? It happens because the people that create one society beget the kind of people that cause the chaos, and then the kind of people that create the chaos beget the kind of people that create the order. It really is two different species. And if you understand that, you might be able to take some action. We'll see. Anyway, that's enough of that question. We don't have time. We're doing all right. Moving on. I like this question. George A. Friedland asks, how might the Cold War have gone if General Patton had survived his last car crash and lived at least another 15 years? Let me take Patton out of this because I don't think it's Patton particularly, because Patton was pretty much marginalized before the war ended. He was marginalized. But let's look at what we're really getting at here. What would have happened after World War II if we had people who understood aggression and the will to fight and the will to use our weapons? What would have happened? I've given this a little bit of thought. I've said this as we were getting ready to go into Iraq. I said it during all the years of the invasion of Iraq. I've been saying it since Iraq. I've been saying it through Afghanistan. I've been saying it since I've been writing politically, just 10 or 12 years now. And that is this. No matter what people around the world talk about, when they talk about America and American militarism and American adventurism and Americans military and Americans invasion, Americans this and American conquest, all this other crap. The one thing I've said, and I'll stand by this, is that the world has not seen America really and truly angry since 1945. 1945 was the last time this country was all the way angry. And we know this is true because we built fleets of bombers and we destroyed entire cities. We didn't think twice about it. We firebombed Tokyo. The atomic bombs, if you look on the map, the amount of damage done by the nuclear explosions at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you compare those little, let's say those little things are little purple radius, and you compare them with the red radius of all of the cities of Japan combined that firebombing has done, I don't even think you can see the purple radius. They simply just were not a significant contribution, basically, to what was already happening. But we firebombed Japan into submission, did the same in Germany as well. That was the last time we were all the way angry. And then I think that's when the RK shift started to happen. And so the question becomes, what would the history of the world look like if somebody like Patton had influence? If we hadn't gone so R, if we'd stayed more K. I think looking at the little beats of history, what do we have? Stalin basically took over half the world, the whole Iron Curtain, the whole Soviet occupation of Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia, all of this stuff, was a result of him thinking that he'd won World War II single-handedly. They did an awful lot of winning World War II. But because Roosevelt and Eisenhower stopped Patton from taking Berlin, they thought that the West was weak. Not only did we stop ourselves from taking Berlin, we stopped ourselves from taking Vienna. Churchill was ready to go up the Aegean, up the Danube. He was going to take Vienna. He was going to take all of the Eastern European capitals. They would have been Western capitals. There would not have been a Cold War. There would not have been an Iron Curtain. It would have been Russia versus Europe and America. But we stopped. So what would have happened if we didn't stop? Well, if we had allowed George Patton to go, this is just speculation, but I think this is without, I don't think there's much question about what I'm about to say. If I could have rewritten history, let me put it to you this way. Here's what I would have done. I would not have stopped Patton. I would have let Patton go, and I would have put everything I had behind Patton. I would have had the war end and the Russians and the Americans shake hand as far east as possible instead of what we actually did, which was have them shake hands as far west as possible. Which means that all of those, there would have been no East Germany, there would have been no East Berlin, there wouldn't have been a Russian-occupied Poland, there wouldn't have been a Russian-occupied Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, none of it. We would have just pushed Western armies to the borders. The Germans would have surrendered to us. We know that they wanted to surrender to us. Entire units went hundreds of miles, and individual citizens walked for hundreds of miles just so they could surrender to us. So this isn't stretch on my part. It's not like it was the other way around. It's not people. The Germans wanted to surrender to the West, so we could have pushed as hard as we wanted to, and we would have put that boundary between us and the communists a lot farther east than it was. But that's just the beginning of the issue, because Stalin understood that since we withheld our might, there was something wrong with us. From his point of view, there was something wrong with us. He thought we were weak and silly. And so what do we see after the 40s? And there would have been no Berlin airlift. There would have been no Cuban Missile Crisis, because it never would have gotten to the point of the Cuban Missile Crisis for reasons I'm about to elucidate. When North Korea invaded South Korea, the United Nations found themselves at war with communism. And in a world that I would have preferred to live in, a world that would have saved hundreds of millions of lives, not just a few people's lives, saved lives. I would have stabilized the situation the way that we did. I would have done the Incheon landing and all of that brilliance. And once I had the situation stabilized, and once we pushed the North Koreans back to the boundaries of North Korea, when the Chinese came into the Korean War, and that Chinese wave pushed the Americans back again, in my opinion, as a student of history, that's when history turned. That's when history turned. When Truman said to MacArthur, we're not going to use nuclear weapons against the Chinese because we don't want to start a nuclear war with the Russians, who at that time may have had a bomb or two. We had 25 or 30. We had entire air forces. We had the most powerful navy in the world. We had fighter jets. We had everything. War with Russia was laughable. It was hysterical. If it had been me running the presidency throughout the history since the end of World War II, I would have ended World War II as far east as possible. When the Chinese launched that invasion of North Korea, I would have done what MacArthur wanted to do. I would have put nuclear weapons on a frozen wasteland on enemy military targets. I would have used nuclear weapons to stop massed Chinese assaults. China didn't have any nuclear weapons. The UN sanctioned the Korean War. They sanctioned the American position, the Western position in the Korean War. North Korea was aggressors in that war, not us. No one would have done boo about it. Would have done boo. And we're not talking about these giant H-bomb city killers either. We would have used tactical nuclear weapons against massed Chinese formations. And if we had done that, then I don't believe there would have been a Vietnam. I just don't believe there would have been a Vietnam. You know why? Because the communists would have realized that the West believed in itself and thought there was something worth fighting for. They would have said, my God, these most powerful people in the world actually believe in their civilization, they believe in their own culture, and they are prepared to fight for it, and we can't match these people. We can't possibly match these people. We're not going to fight them. That would have been the end of the Korean War, and I think it would have been the end of the Vietnam War without the Vietnam War ever having been fought. But let's say that the Vietnam War was, in fact, fought. Let's say after putting nuclear weapons on again, I'm not talking about bombing Beijing here. I'm talking about putting tactical nuclear weapons on military units in Korea. Let's say that we did that. And let's just say that they decided, well, maybe they were just kidding, and they'd started the Vietnamese War. From the beginning of the war in Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson was fighting an R-type war. He was fighting an R war, a war of attrition, a war that culls our warriors. By 1964, we were no longer the same country that we were in 1944. We weren't the same country in 1954. Something happened between 45 and 55. That's when it happened. By 1965, we're in Vietnam. What was Johnson doing? Johnson was personally in the basement of the White House picking bombing targets, determining the ingress and egress routes of strike packages. He was basically telling American pilots, you're going to have to overfly Haiphong Harbor, and as you come feet dry over the shoreline to hit your targets in northern Vietnam, North Vietnam, you're going to get to look down at the ships, at the Russian ships that are unloading the SAMs that are going to shoot you down and kill you. You get to watch them, take them off the boat. You get to fly over them in your A4s and your intruders and your Sky Raiders. You get to look down and watch them unload the SAMs off of those Russian ships in that harbor that are going to shoot you and your buddies down. And so then Johnson would bomb North Vietnam. He'd bomb Hanoi, but he'd bomb them for a little while. Then he'd stop. Why would you stop? Johnson stopped because he wanted to make it look like a gesture of goodwill. See, this is the part I don't understand. at war with the country. You're bombing their cities. And now you're going to stop bombing for a while as a gesture of goodwill? In order to do what? Once these people saw how Johnson was fighting the Vietnam War, they said they're insane. And as the war dragged on, because there's a lot of support for the war in the early part of the war, right up until Tet, we never, ever put our full force into that theater, because if we had, that war would have been over very, very quickly. Even as late as 1972, Creighton Abrams, when he took over from Westmoreland a little bit before the end before our ignominious departure from the Vietnam War. But Creighton Abrams basically said, we've been fighting a war of attrition. Think about that. We're trading American kids for Vietnamese kids, for Asian kids. That just doesn't make any sense mathematically. Forget about whose team you're on and forget about this whole business of this being your kids and your children and people trying to protect. It's also kind of a little bit goes to the issue that the Victorians had when they were fighting these bush wars all over the place. Victoria, I think during Victoria's reign, I think the British went to war. I want to say it was 72 different individual, not just engagements, 72 different individual little mini wars and police actions and so on during the reign of Victoria. Something like that, some incredible number. And Kipling wrote a little poem where he basically said, here's a British officer with, 5,000 pounds of 5,000 pounds sterling of training and education. He went to Oxford. He speaks Latin and Greek. He can do calculus on the back of a notebook. Here's a man who understands astronomy, physics. He understands biology. He collects butterflies in his spare time. There's a guy with an incredible education. This guy with a 5,000 pound education is killed by a guy with a 10 rupee spear. So why we would get into a war of attrition when we've got supersonic jet fighters against people who essentially had bamboo spears is a bit of a mystery to me. And that's the first part of it. And then the second part of it is, if you're going to put your people at risk, you need to get this thing over with. And Creighton Abrams had a plan where he basically said, I don't need more troops, Mr. President. I don't need wonder weapons. I don't need anything. We got enough guys in theater, more than enough guys in theater right now. Instead of us taking a hill, taking our losses, retreating, letting the VC or the NVA take the hill, and then go take the hill again, we're going to stop this bullshit right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to take an armored column. We're going to march right up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're just going to take American armor with American air cover and American infantry, and we are going to go right up their supply route. We're just going to back them right up. We're going to cross into North Vietnam, and then we're going to put these tanks in the center of the town square at Hanoi, which is precisely what they did in the Iraq War, and it would have been over in 6 weeks. It would have been over in 6 weeks. We didn't get that, but we got something like that because all of a sudden Nixon says, well, I want this war over. I want it to end. So what did he do? He started bombing Hanoi hard with B-52s. They came to the peace talk table within, 10 days, a week, 2 weeks? This peace talks that had been eluding Johnson for 6 years of this slaughter and this carnage, and tonight 17 American dead and 22 young men killed. And Walter Cronkite reading off those figures. I remember my mom watching TV and watching me. I was probably 13, 14 years old, thinking, this isn't going to be good for Bill in another 5 years. No, just go up there and stop it. So Nixon starts to bomb Hanoi. The North Vietnamese come to the peace table, and instead of stopping, it was linebacker too, Dave. Instead of bombing them and stopping, we kept bombing them until we had a peace agreement, and then the war was over. But again, that war would never have happened if we'd used nuclear weapons against the Chinese. And if we were serious about winning the Vietnamese War, we would have. I'm not saying we should have nuked Hanoi. I'm not saying that was the thing to do. I got a chance to interview the guy who invented the neutron bomb. He was a really interesting guy. A good man, too. I liked him very much. I got a chance to talk to him in the last year of his life. I spent hours and hours and hours at his house. And he basically said, look, this is what the neutron bomb was invented for. You could have put neutron bombs over the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And yes, it's absolutely true. You would have killed a large number of North Vietnamese soldiers. But you wouldn't have killed 2 million of them. You wouldn't have killed 1/10 of that. You wouldn't have killed 100th of that. You wouldn't have killed 1,000th of that. You would have just ended the war. And our job is not to protect their casualties, by the way. Our job is to protect our casualties. That's the American president's job, is not to protect Vietnamese soldiers' lives. His job is to protect American soldiers' lives. A couple of neutron bombs down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and all of a sudden the war's over. And so once again, it's like these actions are not only effective, and they're not only good for us, and they're not only save American lives, but like the nuclear bombing of Japan, they save the lives of the Japanese, they save the lives of the Koreans, they save the lives of the Vietnamese by ending it. By ending it. And for those people out there who still think that America deserved to lose the Vietnamese War and that this whole thing was a catastrophe, every now and then I'll go down to Target and I'll buy a package of Hanes underwear, and I'll open that package up and I'll look on the inside and it will say "Made in Vietnam." So this whole thing happened for what? They're capitalists. They make money. They like making money. Their lives are improved by making money. And all of those millions of people who were executed after the war because they had the temerity to support America, that wouldn't have happened if I'd been running the thing either. If Patton had been running the thing. If Grant or somebody like that, General Grant. President Lincoln, as an example. Lincoln put his full forces into the field. Lincoln, whatever faults you may have with Lincoln, I know a lot of people who fear big government have a lot of problems with Abraham Lincoln, but put that aside for a minute. If you look at Lincoln as a war president, Abraham Lincoln put everything he had into the field at all times. And Lincoln aged 20 years in 4 years, not because he was doing the Johnson thing of, well, we'll hit him and then we'll pause and we'll show him some goodwill. Lincoln aged 20 years in 4 years because Lincoln could not find a general who would take the armies that he had in barracks to war. We won the Vietnamese War. We never lost on the battlefield in that war. Every time we had an objective, we took it. And by the time the ceasefire was over, when we stopped shooting, what was the situation? Was Hanoi running the flag of North Vietnam? No. The war ended when America left. The war ended with the boundaries where they were at the beginning. And it was only 2-3 years after we left combat operations that the U.S. Congress sold out support to the to the South Vietnamese government. And then they just rolled in. They just bided their time and waited. That never would have happened if we had been serious about fighting. So here's the point I'm going to close with about all this stuff. People think that by not fighting, by running away, and by doing limited warfare, by not using nukes on the Chinese army as they invaded North Korea on behalf of the North Koreans who started the whole thing in the first place, by not using a couple of nuclear weapons there, we were not being kind, and we were not being decent, and we were not showing how civilized we were. We were doing just exactly the opposite. We were proving to them that we weren't willing to fight for what we believed in, and what should have been a war that might have lasted 2 or 3 months if we'd put in our full force in Korea ended up taking 2 or 3 or 4 years, whatever it was. A war in Vietnam that should have lasted a year, top end, to get everything in theater, and held our guys back at the bases until we're ready to go. You march them up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You use what we're good at. We've got tanks. We have jet aircraft. Push them up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Put a couple of neutron bombs on the trail ahead of us to get some of those troops out of the way. That war would have been over in a year. Instead of losing 50,000 people, we would have lost 500 people. And instead of the Vietnamese losing, God knows how many they lost, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million civilians, the NVA would have lost 20,000, 50,000 casualties. We would have saved enormous amounts of lives. Their lives as well as ours, although I don't think we're responsible for saving their lives. But that's what would have happened if we had been willing to fight. But we're not, and so we don't. And the same thing happened to Hitler, and the same thing is happening right now with Putin. This is not my opinion. It's not my opinion. They got, after the war, they recovered the records of OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German High Command, and they found out that in the year that Adolf Hitler sent German troops into the Rhineland in violation of the Treaty of Versailles, when he marched those troops over that bridge and violated the treaty by militarizing the Rhineland, OKW, the German generals, wrote in real time that if Hitler meets any resistance, we will not only turn around and come back home with our tail between our legs, but we will take this lunatic Adolf Hitler out in back of a shed someplace. We'll put a bullet in his head, which means that a marching band, a French or a British, but it's French territory, a French marching band on the bridge in the Rhineland could have stopped World War II. I personally believe that a single French police gendarme, a policeman with a wooden baton, standing on the middle of that bridge and watching these German mechanized columns, if that man had the courage that many American marshals and sheriffs had, if one man had stood there and said, I'm not trying to tell you that my wooden baton cannot stop you and your line of Panzer tanks. I'm telling you, you will have to kill me to do it. And if you kill me to do it, you will bring about the destruction of your country. Make your decision, Herr General. They would have turned around. That's not my opinion. That's what the German general said. So we fight to protect the peace. And the mockery that the Strategic Air Command got for their motto, peace is our profession. The mockery that they got. How it's a sickening, disgusting idea that hydrogen bombs save lives. No, it's not. It's actually the truth. They really do. If they hadn't had the hydrogen bomb, we would have been in conventional warfare with these communists for 50 years now. That Strategic Air Command motto was true, and their logo is not the word I'm looking for. Their command crest, their insignia, I guess is the word I'm looking for. Their insignia, to me, I never forget it. I put that decal on so many models. I think it's the coolest thing I've ever seen, ever, is that the insignia of the Strategic Air Command. It's a field of blue. It's a mailed fist with a lightning bolt in it. Peace is our profession. They're right. They're historically right. There's no doubt about it. It's not up for discussion. I'll do one more because the traffic is dying down. And then I'm going to keep some of these because, frankly, I'm just going to do some of these next week. They're just too damn good. We'll get some new ones, but I'm hanging on to these. I like this one, and I'm going to take it, then we'll call it a night. Stephen Dakota Tucker says, what are your thoughts on subjective and objective reality? That's a profound question. And I'll tell you why I liked it and why I'm going to stay a little late to answer that question. My entire theory of everything is that there is an objective reality. If I didn't believe in objective reality, then the search for truth would be meaningless. If I didn't believe in objective reality, then there'd be no point of the rule of law. There'd be nothing. There'd be no truth to search for. Justice is based on the administration of the truth, of fairness. Somebody got hurt. Did that happen? Yes. Well, then what do we do to make it up to them as best as we can? How do we make them as whole as we can? How do we administer justice? Well, the justice has to be predicated on the idea that something physically happened to this guy and that it did, in fact, physically happen, and so therefore actions can be taken. So I 100% do believe in objective reality, and I've never, ever, I understand. It's not like I don't understand it. I've just never emotionally connected to this idea. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make a sound? I've never had an instant in my life where I didn't just instantly say, of course it makes a sound. Well, how do you know what a sound is if there's no one there to hear it? It's not really a sound. Don't be ridiculous. Of course there's a sound. Sound is compression of waves through the air. Of course it makes a sound. But if there's no one there, you know what? I know what kind of person you are already. You're the kind of person that's going to break down the falling of a tree in the forest and the loud crash that it makes into tiny little molecules, and you're going to play with each one of these molecules rhetorically, and you're going to do what I heard during the Rodney King trial in Simi Valley described as, and I don't remember who said it, but somebody in that trial said a good attorney can make an argument in such a way by breaking it down into tiny little steps that he can make you believe that an elephant can hang over a cliff with his tail tied to a daisy. Because you'll just have to agree with it. But we all know that a tree makes a sound. A tree falls in the forest, makes a sound. Obviously it does. There is an objective reality. History is the effort to try to determine what actually happened. There are no, this is my truth and your truth. My life experience, this is my opinion, this is my outlook, this is my taste. That's legitimate. But in terms of in my truth, Abraham Lincoln was never shot in the head. You see, I find that unpleasant, so that never happened for me. And my truth is just as valuable as your truth. No, it's not. It's not just as valuable. Your truth may be that people can levitate. That's fine. You're welcome to believe that. It doesn't cost me anything to believe that, because we live in an era of prosperity, and this kind of R-selected idiocy is tolerated because I don't need you working on the farm making enough food for us to survive, and I don't need you out there on the line defending us against Indians or wolves or the warlike Canadians or whatever the case may be. If you want to believe that people can levitate in a society as prosperous as the one that the sensible people have made, then knock yourself out. By the way, I mentioned tribes earlier, and I got off the reason I mentioned tribes. I was talking about this archaic thing with tribes, and the one thing I came up with tribes was, what do we call these tribes? And I wanted a term that both sides could like. I know it's a small diversion, but it's the whole reason I brought up tribes earlier in the show anyway. Why did I pick the two different colors? I wanted colors that both teams thought would be appropriate for them. And so instead of the red and the blue tribe or the white and the black tribe, I said there's the gray tribe, which is the practical tribe, and the gray tribe is the color of the lead of an engineer's mechanical pencil. And then there's the pink tribe, and the pink is the color of Angeline's Corvette. Because if you ask a liberal emotionally, if you had to be painted pink or gray, which color would you choose? Liberals would be painted pink. If you ask a conservative if you'd rather be painted pink or gray, I'm not dealing with with women and individual tastes. I'm just talking about as a group, right? As an individual group. As a group of people with shared values. Most conservatives rather consider, I'd paint myself a color, I'd rather drive a gray car than a pink car. I'd rather be considered gray than pink. I'd rather be considered practical than emotional, and the liberals feel the exact opposite. But anyway, back to this subjective and objective reality. So now we get to the interesting part, because I do believe in objective reality, but I also believe that there are such incredible limits to our perception, and that the more we learn about the universe, the stranger it becomes. That's really remarkable. You would have thought, and certainly at the turn of the 1900s, and even up through the war period, the world seemed very predictable. Certainly seemed predictable to the Victorians. We have Newtonian gravitation, explains where the planets are and how they work. They're going to be going in this giant piece of clockwork forever. We have a steady state universe, and the Andromeda Galaxy is just a nebula, and it's just this big, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. And everything's predictable, and everything makes sense, and everything's understandable. And as time goes on, the universe gets simpler and simpler and simpler because we understand it better and better and better. But that's not what's happening at all. On the contrary, what's happening is the more we discover about the core foundational level of the universe, the more we realize, my God, we don't have a clue. We don't have a clue. What is quantum foam? There's more energy. There's more energy in a vacuum the size of a light bulb. In the vacuum contained in a volume of a light bulb, there's more energy available, if you knew how to get to it, than you could ever use to power Western civilization to the end of time. We talk about things like gravity and electrical charges as an exchange of particles. Nobody really believes that, right? Nobody really believes that there are actual physical particles that are being emitted. These are just the closest that our little monkey brains can come to understanding very profound, very, very profound laws and operators that we're just able to get a glimpse on. And for those of you having a hard time understanding what I'm saying here, the best way for me to describe this to you in terms of what we think we know versus what's real is to use an expression you'll often hear in physics, and you'll often hear in other disciples as well. And that expression is, the map is not the territory. So the problem with people today, the problem with atheists, and the problem with the global warming people, the problem with the religious people too, the problem with people today, and it's been true throughout all of history because people haven't changed that much. People's problem when they come to trying to figure things out is they have the arrogance of thinking that the map is the territory. You see this as clearly as you ever hope to see it with this global warming thing. It's not global warming anymore. Why not? Because the global warming doesn't match our models. Maybe your models are wrong. That's impossible. No, the models can't be wrong. I made the models. So it's got to be, the scientists today use the term skeptic as a term of derision for people who they're claiming are non-scientific. Skepticism is the essence of science. Skepticism is the essence of the scientific method. To call people who don't buy into the global warming theory skeptics is for scientists to admit not only that they're probably right, but that they don't understand the first thing about science because they're not doing science anymore. They're doing religion. So, the map is not the territory. What does that mean? What it means is when we talk about a particle that carries the gravitational attraction, for example, that means that we have a map of Texas, let's say. And we look at this map of Texas and we say, well, it's a pretty good map. We've got lines that indicate where all the major roads are. We've got shaded areas where the cities are. We can see the topographical relief. We're you know what, making the map better every day. Now we've got little areas that show us where the hills are. See, these are little contour lines of elevation. So the map is even more like Texas than we originally thought. See, we really understand Texas now. And then all of a sudden along come Google Earth, and now not only do you not only just get a map and pictures of Texas, but you get a photograph, and you can zoom all the way in on a car. And if you zoom in all the way on the size of a car and start to scroll across Texas, you get an idea of how big Texas is. But Google Earth is still a map. It's still a map. It's not the territory. When you think about the most sophisticated map you've ever seen, the most sophisticated map you've ever seen is much like the most sophisticated scientific theory that we have. But now I want you to envision the perfect map of Texas, and let's say it takes the size of an entire football field. And let's say that you look down there on the map, then you've got all the rivers and the water's flowing, you've got traffic flow on the freeway, you've got all this other stuff, right? You think, well, now we really understand Texas. But you don't understand anything about Texas. Because if you take that Super Bowl or football field size map of Texas, and you take that Super Bowl, so I keep saying Super Bowl, if you take that football size field area that has this amazing, awesome lit up map of Texas, and you put that football field on any part of the real Texas, there'll be more unknown things inside that football field than you ever could have accounted for in all of your maps. There'll be trillions of bacteria that you're completely unaware of. There'll be trillions of viruses. There'll be life forms you don't know about. There'll be spiders here, but not over there. There'll be these kind. The level of complexity of the territory is millions of times greater than the map. So when you ask me, do I believe in subjective and objective reality, I do believe in objective reality, but I also understand that while I never lose my belief in objective reality can produce some very interesting and subjective results. When you set up an experiment, you pass a beam of light through a slit, and it shows up as a series of particles. The photons act as particles. But then you turn a camera on, or you stand there and watch it, and you do it again, and the results come out differently. What is the definition of subjective truth? If the fact that you observe something happening changes the outcome, and this is not up for discussion, if the fact that you observe something changes the outcome, not by touching it, just by watching it, then what does subjective reality mean? What does that mean? This has been proven to my satisfaction mathematically and through small-scale experiments on the small end of quanta. And mathematics and quantum physicists and metaphysicists basically argue that what happens on the infinitesimally small level with individual quantum reactions and their probabilities, what happens on the large scale when I drop, if I were to drop this, what can I drop? There's a little controller for my lights, right? If I drop this controller, right, it's going to hit the ground, right? Well, technically, if I drop this controller, what's really going to happen is a series of probabilities are going to be placed into action. And the probabilities are so overwhelming that all of these molecules and all of these atoms are going to tunnel in the same direction as a result of the gravitational force that, yes, this will hit the ground. And you know how many times it's going to hit the ground? 100% of the times. But it's not technically guaranteed. There is, in fact, a chance that it won't. And that chance is so small that the chance really, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist, but there's a chance that it won't. Wow. Think about that. And if it turns out that by observing things we change them, this is what changed my religious beliefs. If as we know, by observing an action, we change the action, then doesn't that mean that the more sophisticated the observer is, the more change that the observer will be able to influence on the creation? If it turns out that time doesn't exist, that time doesn't belong in the mathematics of explaining why things are the way they are, then you begin to realize that time is in fact a perceptual issue for us. This idea that time is in fact not linear, that would have been considered a subjective belief. Oh, you have your idea of time, that time goes on 1 second per second and 1 hour per hour into the future forever and that can never run backwards. That's your belief. My belief is that time is fluid and changing. Turns out time is fluid and changing because time probably doesn't exist. And the way to think about that is when you look, this is going to date us, but if you have an LP of the Eagles' greatest hits, let's say, side A, what part of the 5 or 6 songs on that album is real? If I'm holding an LP and it's got 6 tracks on it, let's say it's the Eagles' greatest hits, what part of this disc is real? All of them are real. But when you put the needle down and you play the song, there's only one thing that's happening at that instant, and that is that little guitar solo out of Hotel California. We're hearing that now, but just because the needle is located over those grooves and vibrating and we're hearing that, that doesn't mean that that part of Hotel California is any more or less real than the rest of the groove on the album, because it's not a series of grooves, really just one groove, right? So time is beginning to look like that. Time is beginning to look like a cursor, and we only experience it one way because chemical reactions only work one way. It's the arrow of time, but that doesn't mean that time is in fact an entity the way we understand it. My personal belief, based on the science and the little that I know, and I have an understanding of how little I know, I believe that time is baked into the universe, and strangely enough, this is one of the paradoxes, that we just don't have the volume to understand. If I put a hamster, I learned this from Howie, this little bird I had. If I put a hamster on a little elevated platform, I can explain to that hamster how to fly an instrument approach, and I can take that hamster through 10,000 instrument approaches, but that hamster is never going to forget to manipulate the controls. That hamster is never going to understand how to fly an instrument approach. It's never going to happen. That hamster is never going to be able to divide 642 by 69. The hamster will never be able to do it no matter how hard he tries, because he doesn't have the volume. He just literally doesn't have the hardware. And we have limited hardware. If you're trying to tell me that this little cantaloupe-sized blob of gray jelly is all the hardware there is, then you got another thing coming. We have an ability to perceive the universe that is limited by our ability to perceive things. Time is one of these things. We understand time in a certain way because that's all we can do. It's all we're capable of understanding it for. If our brains were the size of watermelons instead of cantaloupes, maybe this whole time thing would be crystal clear to us. But it's not. With all of that said, which sounds very depressing and very humiliating and very anti-arrogance, because it's supposed to knock you off of your arrogance. With all of that said, doesn't it just knock your breath away? Doesn't it just suck the air out of your lungs to think about the fact that we tree monkeys who just decided to walk upright because of probably affected our heat distribution, that we, over time and listening to what other people had said and writing down the results, doesn't it blow your mind that we're able to determine what happened in 1/15 billionth of a second after creation? Isn't that just astonishing? It's astonishing that we can create something like this, that we can build something like this that has all of these abilities, that we can make a flat piece of glass and plastic glow in such a way that I can read things and understand things and see. It's astonishing. It's astonishing. The power of what persistence will do, because that's really what it comes down to. I don't remember where I wrote this. It was one of my essays in Silent America, but technology and science and civilization is just practice, folks. Just practice. It's just learning how to do little things and then learning how to do big things. This is known as heuristics, and we'll talk about heuristics some other time. Anyway, I have to go see the Blogfather because I wouldn't be sitting here without him. But, you know, when you think about the hatred that the progressives and the leftists have for humans, I'll never understand it. I don't see us as horrible people, horrible species. I think we're a terrific, amazing species, and not just because of our technological achievements either. We do animalistic things, and we torture and rape and commit acts of cruelty, and we're specially suited to do that because of our intelligence. But we're also the only creatures in the world that have a sense of right and wrong and try to do something about it. That's amazing to me, absolutely amazing. And when you think about humans and how warlike and brutal we are compared to the peaceable animals, I had an anthropologist tell me this when I was a freshman in college in 1979. He says, you can talk about how warlike man is, and you can talk about how savage we are to our fellow human beings and so on. He said, but I'm looking out in a room and there's 180 of you here. And he said, if you put 180 apes in a room this size, pretty soon there'd be one ape. You put 180 dolphins in an area this size, pretty soon there'd be 5 dolphins. You put 180 anything in this size environment scaled to that particular creature, it would be blood on the walls. We're the only species that know how to sit still, sit next to each other. No other animals do this. You pack this many lions together as you get in a stadium. You put 100,000 lions cheek to jowl for 3 hours, and amp them up on top of it with like, this is our team. No, this is our. There'd be nothing left but fur. It's an amazing species, and I credit the success of humanity to 2 things. First of all, we eat anything. You think about that. There's nothing on this planet that we don't eat. We eat anything. Insects, reptiles, bugs, fish, mammals, it doesn't matter. If it's made out of biology, we eat it. That's one thing. And the other thing is we're infinitely adaptable. We're learning machines. We can learn to live in the ice. We can learn to live in the desert. We can learn to live in space. We can learn to live in cities. We can learn to live on farms. And that's why we disagree, because our learning pathways are different. And that's why we disagree with liberals, and that's why we disagree with Muslims, and that's why we disagree with the hairy-browed people who live up in the high country. We just learned different heuristics, different lessons that we built other lessons out of. That'd be a conversation to have next time. This was a great episode, a lot of fun. I wish I had more time, although I think actually 2.5-hour shows are way too long. This is 90 minutes. It's not bad. So as always, thanks again for your tremendous support. And as I said at the beginning, to get an encoding error on this DVD thing after being as late as it is enough to make a man like me just basically cry like a girl. But we're getting it fixed and getting it right, and it's close, so close. And we'll see you next time. I'll get the last one up online tomorrow. We'll get this one up online the next day or two. Get caught up. And until then, I'm liking the new lighting very much, by the way. Little purple really tends to balance the color out. We'll do some more deep thoughts next time. We'll take some questions that we didn't take, and we'll get some new ones from you. So again, thanks for the support. Thanks for letting me sit in this chair and make a living by, blabbing about all these things that have slowly crawled into my thick head over the course of 40 or 50 years of intense loneliness, hatred, anger, and fear. And we'll do it again next week, as we always do. And thanks again for the support. So we'll see you next time. Have a great evening, and take care now. Bye-bye.